So that's the GAA and where we all belong. One of the GAA's principal sponsors is Allianz, and Allianz is also our backer of the Sport for Social Good project. And I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Valerie Hedin from Allianz and by Niamh Murphy from In the Company of Huskies. You're very welcome to Sport for Business, ladies. The reason why you're here today is slightly at a tangent to sport, but that doesn't make it any less important. Towards the end of last year, you launched a campaign in support of Women's Aid, which was incredibly powerful and was an absolute best-in-class example of how a corporate organisation working with a good agency can produce something which is going to make people stop and think. And unfortunately, we saw in the early part of this year when Aisling Murphy, a young lady in Ireland who was out for a run and suffered the most tragic of circumstances and lost her life at the hands of somebody else. The ad just popped back into my head as being an example of what we need to do and how we need to actually look at things. So you're very welcome. And I'm going to invite you now to just talk us through the sort of, the motivation, the mechanics of actually building out that campaign and what it was. So over to you.
Thanks very much, Rob. I think it's important to say from our perspective, getting involved in this issue, it was very important that we did so inside and out. So it's not just about the campaign, but it's about the partnership as a whole. So Allianz has been supporting communities for over 100 years, but as part of our approach to sustainability, we really wanted to take a particular focus on the impact we could have in society and really take on a social issue. So it wasn't just about a financial contribution. So back in 2020, we embarked on a journey with business in the community to really find out what would be the best fit with us in terms of a social issue. And so we started first with our employees, running a number of focus groups to see what was important to them as an issue, but also where did they feel that we could have relevancy. And as you would expect, many of the major societal issues emerged, like homelessness and mental health, but also the topic of domestic abuse. And from there, then we carried out external research with consumers and non-consumers, again, to find out what was important to them and where they felt that Allianz could play a role. And as you mentioned, Rob, in 2020, as COVID cases soared in Ireland, so too did another pandemic. Domestic abuse skyrocketed by 43%. And I still distinctively remember those chilling media reports at a time when many of us were being sent home from our workplaces to be safe. For many women, it was the worst possible situation for them to find themselves in. So what the research told us basically was that the area of domestic abuse didn't have significant support by corporate organisations, and there was a real opportunity to get involved, but also they felt that a company like Allianz could make a positive contribution in that area. So just in terms of then the fit with Allianz, because that's what we felt was really important from the outset. Homes are protected, but the people inside them weren't. So when we consider in insurance is about protection at its core. So the area of domestic abuse has direct connections with our products and services, because when you consider that you apply that lens of protection to the homes, and often the issues that happen inside the home, you can see that there's a fitting remit there in terms of the role that insurance can play. And so that was very important for us, that we would have that legitimacy in terms of taking on this social issue. So we, after the almost a year's work and research, then we entered into a 3-year partnership with Women's Aid. And Women's Aid are an incredible organisation who've been supporting women and children in the area of domestic abuse since 1974. And courage and protection are core values of both our organisations. So that's allowed us to really form some solid foundations from the outset. And because in Allianz, our purpose is about securing people's futures, this partnership with Women's Aid really allows us to do that in a unique and impactful way, where we can make a meaningful difference in society. That is an issue that is pervasive and timely, as you say. So we took an approach with Women's Aid where there was a three-pronged approach to the partnership. And this is what was really important. We really wanted to make sure that as an organisation internally, we were equipped and set up to deal with domestic abuse, because the stats are so high in terms of 1 in 4 women impacted by domestic abuse in Ireland, then you know that that's got to be impacting also our workforce. So from the very outset, before we even announced the partnership externally, we carried out training with Women's Aid for 34 of our senior management team, so that they would be equipped to understand various forms of domestic abuse, because it's not just physical, also for them to detect the signs of abuse that may be happening amongst employees, and also then to give them the tools then to manage a disclosure. And we also then developed a domestic abuse policy to ensure that we could support employees that are impacted by domestic abuse. And then the second aspect of that was we really wanted to use our workforce and the reach that we have with our employees of over 600, which was that each of our employees themselves are part of a family and they have a network of friends. So through our work with Women's Aid and an internal communications campaign, we were able to explain to people and educate just the different forms of domestic abuse and how to support and signpost somebody who may be experiencing domestic abuse to get more support. So that's been a main campaign that we've been doing internally. And then that brings us on then to the third element, which is in relation to the public campaign that you've spoken about. So for us, we really wanted to develop a talking piece around domestic abuse, because there is a taboo around domestic abuse in Ireland, and it's something that's been talked about more. But our desire for the campaign and what we spoke to our creative agency about was really about developing a talking piece which would give both domestic abuse survivors and also bystanders the ability and permission to start a conversation that they were both scared to have. And so I'll hand you over to Niamh, who will take you through the process then to getting to the campaign that you've mentioned.
Thanks so much, Valerie. So just to reiterate what Valerie has said, I suppose, in terms of making a meaningful difference within the communities that Allianz was serving, we were really clear in terms of what exactly the objective needed to be in order to do that and help Women's Aid in terms of achieving their mission at a time when it was so critically needed because of that increase in figures. And that was about trying to actually get women to start having conversations about the reality of the situations that they were in, whether they were to talk to their friends, to their supported networks, or ultimately in terms of Women's Aid themselves. We knew that we needed to try and help these women to broach the conversation, which to that point were incredibly difficult for them to start if we wanted to help them within these situations. Now, of course, in terms of starting those conversations, we recognized the fact that there were some major societal barriers that really stood in the way in terms of how women could go about starting these conversations. So working with Women's Aid and looking to their 2019 impact report, there were 3 major barriers that really stood out to us that we recognized were problematic in terms of getting people to start those conversations. The first one being that women were ultimately afraid of people knowing what was happening to them. The second one being that women were afraid of the stigma surrounding domestic abuse within Ireland. And the third one being the fact that they didn't want to be labeled as victims. So ultimately, though, as well, when we thought about as they're called bystanders, so people who might be aware of somebody who's in a situation of domestic abuse, for bystanders, it's almost the other side of that stigma coin. For them, there is such a sense of awkwardness in terms of broaching these topics that was really preventing these life-saving conversations from happening. So it was clear that if shame and embarrassment were, I suppose, the essence in terms of what we're stopping these conversations from happening, then we needed to change the narrative surrounding domestic abuse in order to actually make people start talking about it. Now, the narrative surrounding domestic abuse within Ireland, in a global context, I suppose, when we look back at it in relation to communications, culture, history, is one that has been wrought with images of women who have experienced the physical effects of domestic violence. And while, of course, that's been incredibly beneficial in terms of highlighting the severity and the intensity of the problem, the reality is that, of course, we know that domestic abuse is something that is incredibly nuanced, it is incredibly complicated, it appears in various forms, be that coercive control, financial abuse. There are many different areas that we need to consider. And the problem being that with the current narrative that did exist in terms of how people were talking about domestic abuse was the fact that it really perpetuated this idea of placing women as being the victims, which was the one thing that we knew that they didn't want to be identified as. Because if they didn't see themselves as being victims, how could they necessarily identify with this narrative in terms of starting those conversations and overcoming that stigma? Because the narrative really has kind of perpetuated, I suppose, a lot of these unfortunate terminologies through culture that really reinforce that association. So words like beaten, weak, helpless, battered, broken, victim, these are not things that these women see themselves as. So how could they connect with a narrative that ultimately was perpetuating that? So with the research that we had done with Women's Aid, there was one thing that was really quite evident to us, that despite the fact that there was this narrative that did exist in terms of how people were talking about domestic abuse outside of the situations of those who were actually experiencing it, it was that regardless of what these situations were, that for every woman, there was an incredible demonstration of the unbelievable strength that these women were demonstrating within their situations, whether it was that they were currently experiencing domestic abuse or that they had found their way out of domestic abuse. But it was a universal truth that these women just had such indelible strength in terms of how they were coping with those situations or how they had dealt with those situations. So ultimately, I suppose, in terms of how we were looking at how we could try and tackle this and make sure that we were reducing that social stigma that was surrounding it, that were preventing these life-saving conversations from happening, our ambition with this work really was to actually flip the narrative on this and instead try and bring strength and the incredible strength of these women as being the central focus of this communication. So we wanted to flip the narrative on this and really actually make speaking up about domestic abuse a symbol of strength. Now, in how we were to go about doing that, we had somewhat of a creative challenge in our hands. The concept of strength and female strength particularly, is something that we can, of course, all get behind. But when we think about female strength in terms of how society views that concept, it's interesting in a sense that so often the kind of women who come to mind are often the incredible athletes of sport that would spring to our mind. So, the Misty Copelands of the world, the Serena Williams, the Simone Biles, in an Irish context, the Katie Taylors, or even the Ellen Keens, of course, who Allianz have worked with quite regularly. But the challenge being that if we were to go about redefining how society was viewing domestic abuse, we actually needed to look at how we could try and redefine how society viewed strength in its entirety. Because while absolutely these incredible women of sport are demonstrating strength in incredible ways, we also needed to get the world to recognize that strength also exists in other forms. Strength is also a woman picking up the phone to ask for help when they're in an incredibly difficult situation. Strength is picking up a suitcase in order to leave their homes. Strength is walking out their front door for the final time. Strength is constantly walking on eggshells. And it's pretending that everything is okay when deep down that it is not. So ultimately, in how we had to try and get society to recognize this incredible strength that we knew to be true of all of the women who were experiencing domestic abuse, which unfortunately, as we knew, was on the rise, we decided to borrow from that world that is synonymous with it. So we used the world of sport as our creative device to really make people instantly recognize the incredible strength that these women were demonstrating when they were within these situations. And taking from this world, we flipped the narrative and introduced Ireland to the strongest women in the world. So far from the victim narrative that was serving as a social blocker in terms of actually letting these women start these life-saving conversations, we instead decided to put their incredible strength at the center of our communications. So we might just pause now and we'll play our hero film from the campaign.
Veneno de serpiente.
So the hero video, then we use that across all our communications, and we were really aiming to make an impact. And we worked with Huskies, Teneo and Mediacom to really extend that reach to target both potential victims of domestic abuse, but also to target bystanders. So utilising an above the line campaign with TV, radio, digital. We used influencers, we used PR. We really use every single channel that we could possibly utilise to really get that message out there when we launched the campaign just at the end of November. In terms of the initial results, so we are just 3 months into a 3-year partnership, but already the results have been really promising. We started out, as I said, training our senior management team, and now we've extended that to all people managers. So we have 128 managers that will be trained by the end of the month. In our employee engagement survey, there's 98% sense of pride amongst our employees. Year-on-year traffic to Women's Aid website when the campaign launched in December was up by 282%, phenomenal number. We've had 1.4 million social media engagements, and already, as I say, just 3 months in, 1 in 6 people are spontaneously aware of the partnership already. So that just gives you a flavour of where things are at. We have exciting plans together with Women's Aid and our agency partners to really build on the initial part of the campaign and really start the conversation and to keep it going, because essentially through education and awareness, we all can have an impact on this issue and on the to the people and the communities that it also affects.
That sense of impact is so clearly felt in the film that we just saw. It is, it's incredibly important in terms of the wider society, and looking back on the campaign and seeing those figures of success. It looks as though this was always the right thing to do. This was always something that you felt as though you could make a big difference. But can you remember back to the first moment when you were thinking, because this campaign was created in COVID. So it was created in your kitchens, as opposed to in a nice, comfortable meeting room with a whiteboard. The courage to actually say, yes, we're going to step into this world and make a difference. Can you remember that that almost sense of dread? Do I have permission to do this? Was that something that played on your mind and when you presented it to the senior management?
I think for the first moment that the theme came up, instinctive personally, I felt it was right, and there was an excitement, I would say, amongst us all in our online workshops about this could be a significant moment for a company like Allianz to be making a statement in such a public way. Would really be something that we haven't seen before. So we personally were all immediately energized and really wanted to do something. So there was like 100% commitment to, okay, well, how now can we get the buy-in, and how can we deliver on the ambitions that we instinctively felt was right, and bringing it back to that moment that this is all happening when there was such a spotlight being shown on the area of domestic abuse, and a sense of helplessness from everybody as to, oh, what can I do? This is like horrendous circumstances that women and children are living through. So we took our time, and I think that's been absolutely invaluable. So we went through the process in a really strategic way, making sure that we're getting the right insights to make sure that senior management felt the level of comfort that this was the right thing, and that we had, as I say, a legitimacy to take on this social issue, and that it was important for employees and for the general public. So I think that has really been incredibly important. And then once we got the green light, and then once we met with the various charities that are operating in this area and formed that relationship with Women's Aid, like the energy has just been absolutely incredible. There's a momentum there. And just the feedback that we've been getting since the campaign has gone live, and the ideas even that are forthcoming from within the business and with other partners, that's a testament to this being the right thing to do. And we really now need to build on that and make a difference, so that we do all collectively achieve what we want to achieve from this partnership.
At the start of a journey, it always looks as though it'll be too long. And at the bottom of the mountain, it always looks as though it's going to be too high. And the easy thing is to look to a closer, a closer peak that you can actually scale. But again, stepping into this, the evidence is there. The proof is there that this was a really important thing to do. And as you said, it was a campaign that wanted to spark life-saving conversations. There couldn't be anything more important than that. And yet, the jeopardy that exists, you've mentioned about the importance of language. And for a campaign like this to succeed, it needs to speak to people who are outside of that danger area. But in order to actually speak to them, it's in a language which can sometimes jar a little bit with those who are inside the danger area. You mentioned about how you took your time on this, but was that one of the real challenges that you just needed to make sure, iteration by iteration, that this was something which was going to do the right thing and not inadvertently cause damage?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that would definitely has been so formative and critical has been the support of Women's Aid throughout this entire process, in terms of providing us with that insight and giving us that understanding in terms of the delicacy of the situations that we were talking about. I think one of the most critical aspects as well, in terms of looking at the narrative that we were creating, was also making sure that we weren't creating a piece of communication that was purely speaking to people who could leave. Because the other thing that we were very cognizant of is that there are many women who are in a situation of domestic abuse, which is their day-to-day reality, and which, because of circumstances outside of their control, they may not have the option of leaving. And again, for them, just actually getting through the day is an achievement within itself. So that core message of reminding women that you are stronger than you think was something that we were cognizant needed to work across a variety of different laterals. It needed to work in terms of helping those women who are at a point when they feel that, yes, I can actually reach out. I can actually start the process in terms of removing myself from the situation. But it also needed to be a beacon of hope in terms of helping those people who we knew were very far from that point in their journey.
And creating the hook whereby you can get a very personal message through in a form of mass communication is obviously very challenging as well. Women's Aid clearly were the voice, the conscience, the guide to this campaign. I remember speaking to Marcus O'Bukala from Leinster Rugby on this show a couple of years back, and talking about how sporting organizations pick their charity partners and how they select. And he made a very good point that every charity is very special. Mm. But the challenge is that you need to find a charity that you can make a difference to, that you can work most closely with to affect change. Where was that process? How did that process work out? Because as in any area of social concern where you want to make a difference, there will be a number of different partners that could come into that. So how was the mechanics of the selection process undertaken to actually choose Women's Aid as being the ones that you wanted to make a difference with?
Well, again, through working with business in the community, that we took a very structured approach once we had landed on the right theme, because we, to a certain extent, were also pitching ourselves to the charities as to, well, why would they want to work with Allianz, and what did they believe that we could bring to the table that was something that they would want to get involved in. So, we had to make that commitment and show the sincerity that we were bringing to the table, and then in the charity partners then responded to that. So the time that we took to do that was really to find the right fit, and to find that we both had the shared ambition. And like I spoke about the values of courage and protection, it was just already, the synergies were there with ourselves and Women's Aid, and that they very much saw the internal part in terms of, holding a mirror up to ourselves, so that we internally were very supportive of domestic abuse for our employees, and that would be reflected then in our external campaign. So it was that process and that really made sure that there was that level of comfort, and that we set out then a partnership agreement so that we're both clear on what we want to achieve. And like Niamh has mentioned there, through every aspect, from the brief that we wrote for the agency agencies through every script and every scene. We've involved Women's Aid in that. So this is collaborative work. This is a true partnership, and as I said, we're bouncing ideas off each other in terms of what we can do now over the rest of the 3 years.
You spoke earlier about how sport provided a reference point for that concept of strength, and Allianz is a very strong supporter of sport, both in this country and around the world. You're partners with the GAA, you're partners with the Olympic Federation of Ireland, with Paralympics and the Olympic movement at a global level. What can sporting organizations do to assist you and to assist other partners in terms of verbalizing and visualizing these messages that are outside of their comfort zone? Because every sporting organization knows how to put on a competition. It knows how to open a stadium and to keep people safe and to abide by the rules. But it can be a real challenge sometimes to step outside of that comfort zone as well. Giving away food parcels, like Man United Foundation and like other organizations have done, is a relatively simple, straightforward, physically, logistically, easy to do exercise. But moving into this space, is it something that you feel their reach can be of huge importance as well? So you back it, you let it out into the world, but then what can the sporting organizations, many of whom are watching us here today, do to actually amplify that message?
Oh, it's a really interesting point. And I think that's, having this platform here today and to be talking about it is an essential part of it. This is, starting to lift the taboo that we're all talking about it. And initially, when we started off working in this area, we were clumsy with the language. We didn't understand it. And through the work with Women's Aid, we've been able to educate ourselves and become informed and understand more about the topic. And that's across the board internally, and that brings a level of comfort. So that exchange and that talking point is something then that I believe all organizations can do. And not only, you don't have to be a charity partnership with Women's Aid for companies and sporting organizations to use Women's Aid to bring them in as part of a training program and implement a domestic abuse policy for members and employees. I think that's something that if all companies could do that, because the workplace is often the safe haven for many people, or sports outlets, because it's their access. But sporting organizations have that reach as Matt mentioned, in the heart of every community. So that's going to be incredibly important. And we have some ideas around that. We want to work with our partners to see, well, how can we together work to deliver that message out to where it's needed, and showcase the work that's been done, but also to signpost where people can go to find out more, or where people can go to Women's Aid to get more support. So that's definitely something that will be part of what we can do, and I would encourage everybody to find out more and talk to ourselves. Happy to talk to anybody, and I'm sure Women's Aid would be as well.
And 282% of a website lift later, 1.4 million social media impressions later, that that message is getting out there. But you said this is 3 months into a 3-year campaign. How far out have you got planned what the execution of this is going to look like throughout the rest of 2022 and into 23 and beyond?
Yeah, we've got extensive plans. We've got some exciting plans coming up now in March around International Women's Day, and also, we've committed to our campaign that we're running out over the course of the whole year. And then there's some interesting ideas that we're working on in terms of our sporting partners, but also internally. There's suggestions about the presence that we have in terms of schools being the number one insurers of schools, and how can we use other aspects of our business. We're inviting our brokers to participate in our training with Women's Aid on domestic abuse. So, just trying to use our reach both externally through communications campaigns, but also with the relationships of our customer base, which is incredibly important, because for a company with the size of Allianz, with the reach we have with both our employees, but also customers, we can directly get into the homes of people that are affected by domestic abuse and inform those who may know, family or friends in their network that are impacted by it. So, having those channels there are really important. And you'll see lots more happening over the course of the year, but definitely keep an eye on the week commencing the 7th of March.
We will very much look forward to that indeed. And we really appreciate you taking the time to come and share with us this morning what it is that you're looking to achieve with this. It is the case that it requires somebody to stand up in order to actually make a difference, to be courageous, to actually think, yes, this is me. And too easily, we can walk on by, we can scroll by, we can look the other way, we can think, oh, well, yeah, that's great, I must do something about that. But you've chosen to actually step into it and do it. And that is making an enormous difference. We will look forward to for the coming years and maybe tracking back in on this and seeing how the progress has been made. And for those of you who are watching, if you've been impacted by hearing Valerie and Niamh saying what they've been saying today, and that you've seen the campaign and you think that your organization can work in some way to amplify it as well, try not to look at the obstacles to that. Try and look at the fact that, well, look, it might be a simple phone call, it might be a simple email, but to get in touch. It's part of what we do as a network. We bring together sporting organizations and businesses, and please do get in touch, raise your hand and make a difference in what has been a very spectacular campaign. So my thanks to Niamh and to Valerie for sharing that with us today.